This is Jane Rogerson. I'm the Communications Director with AARP Maine, and it is my distinct pleasure to be here today with Captain Jonathan Bratten, who is the historian with the Maine National Guard. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So we wanted to do something special this year to celebrate Veterans Day, and this is a really special year for veterans all over the world. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Jonathan?
It is. In addition to being Veterans Day, it is also Armistice Day. It is the anniversary of the date that the hostilities in World War I finally came to an end. So after 4 years of some of the worst, most brutal warfare the world had ever seen, there was finally peace on the battlefield. Now, it would eventually take some time for a negotiated peace to come about, but this was the day when the shooting stopped. What is very significant about this specific year is that this is the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. And so this is a time where we take a moment to pause and reflect what has happened in the past 100 years. What has the world been made safe for democracy, as President Woodrow Wilson said when he declared his war aims when the U.S. entered the war in 1917? What are the effects of the war? What are the effects of the war that still continue to reverberate through time with us today?
And one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot is your involvement in this incredible Smithsonian Channel produced film, which we're actually screening here today as we film this. But can you tell us a bit more about that and that amazing connection to Maine?
Sure. So in 2016, I began work on a Smithsonian Channel documentary entitled Americans Underground Secret Cities of World War I. Which, if you have the Smithsonian Channel, you can go on and watch anytime. The idea, the premise behind it is that in 1917, 1918, when some of the first American troops arrived in France for World War I, because remember, we weren't part of the war until 1917, they sought out refuge in underground shelters and caves and quarries. Now, some of the first troops to arrive were New England soldiers, including about 2,000 to 3,000 men from Maine.
It's amazing already.
And so you have to imagine, these young New England boys, they're leaving not only Maine, New England for the first time, but now the entire country, making the Atlantic crossing, arriving in France, and then being subjected to some of the worst warfare known to humanity at the time. And so they seek shelter in these underground quarries where they're safe from artillery fire and poison gas. And in these spaces, they leave a memento, if you will. The soldiers carve their names, they carve symbols of home, Maine-specific symbols, loggers, lumberjacks, fishermen, all hidden in the darkness in these quarries in France that are still preserved to this day. So it's this really amazing signature, if you will, left by these young soldiers, signature in time left for us as a reminder that they were there and that we should remember them, especially on this Armistice Day.
And when you see the film, it's amazing because the first shots you don't get an idea of how huge this space is, and it's like a maze of, it's a labyrinth really of these tunnels and caves.
It is. The one we were in, one of them was about 8 kilometers long. And we didn't even go down all the offshoots of it. They're old quarries from dating back to the 15th century, so I mean they're extensively mined. It's absolutely incredible, and it gives you some sense of the scale of World War I. I mean, just a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen, and up until the Second World War, it was the war. I mean, it was the war that captivated people's imaginations and memories. And unfortunately, as sort of the byproduct of World War I, we did get World War II because it did not solve the underlying issues of war and the issues of self-determination of peoples. And still things that we see struggled over in the world today.
Yes. And I think, just when World War II began, my father served in the British Royal Navy, and I think there was still the impact of the First World War on those young men going to the Second World War.
Definitely, both in the British and Commonwealth militaries as well as the U.S., there's a strong sense of tradition and duty. And so for a lot of those young men who went off in World War II, they had listened to what their fathers had said about World War I. And of course there was the war dramatically really affected the psyche of each country that was involved to a certain degree. In the U.S., we sort of went from World War I into the Great Depression, and that sort of erased World War I. We didn't want to think about World War I; it's too depressing. It was already bad enough during the Depression, and then World War II happened, and then you watch the generations of World War I veterans vanish into the fabric of society almost seamlessly. They're just very few writings, very few interviews, far less than you see for the World War II generation. And so one of the efforts that we're trying to do on the centennial of World War I is to capture the voices of these World War I veterans, now long gone. There are no living World War I veterans. The last one passed away in 2011. And to be able to bring those out and present them to the people, and even their own families. Many of them didn't talk to their own families about it. And so it's really listening, taking a moment to pause and listen and say, what were they trying to tell us? What did they want to tell us? And what can we learn from that?
So if you have somebody in your family who may be a member from this incredible time, and there are stories to share, and they'd like to maybe contact you, how can people do that in the state of Maine?
People can, the easiest way is to go through the Maine National Guard, either go through the Public Affairs Office, or as simply as if you have Facebook, just look up either Maine National Guard or Maine National Guard History and send that page a message, and I'll be in contact with you probably in about 24 hours. That's the easiest way to do it.
Okay, that's perfect. Well, thank you again, Captain Jonathan Bratten from the Maine National Guard. It's just such a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time.